Welcome to the 14th Cambridge International Conference on Evidence-Based Policing. The theme of our conference this year is Just Right Policing, for which my subtitle is A Job for Science. And I'd like to introduce this topic in the context of our two speakers in this opening session, our two plenary speakers, keynoting this conference. One is here with us. That's Chief Constable Andrew Marsh of the College of Policing. The other had hoped very much to be with us, but his government had different plans for him, and so he's coming to us live at 5 a.m. New Zealand time, which is about an hour from now. So let us honor their commitment by thinking in advance about the broader framework in which they will address this question of just right policing. Because from the assassination of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in Japan to the slaughter of schoolchildren in Texas, police around the world are blamed for under-policing, defined as failures to prevent harm. From the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota to the vigil for Sarah Everard in London, police also have lost legitimacy for over-policing, defined as causing disproportionate harm in the context. And as the pace of both kinds of signal failures, that is, massively publicized events, which speak powerfully, if only symbolically, about the state of policing at a given time and a given place. As the pace in the global media world seems to increase, especially in the democratic world, under a rule of law, many good citizens shake their heads and they ask of policing, why can't they just get it right? The truth, of course, is that police do get it right most of the time around the democratic world, millions of times an hour on routine business. That fact is not newsworthy. It has always been the rare event that gets the police in trouble, and the same is true for airplane crashes, fires, and automobile collisions. Yet each of these rare events becomes predictable and preventable with a long enough time frame. So rather than blaming bad luck or an act of God, scientists in recent decades have massively reduced deaths from commercial air travel, household fires, and car crashes. Their success derives in part from abandoning the attractive idea of good enough decision-making in favor of the competing idea of getting decisions just right. Both approaches may have their place in the right context. Indeed, as a new parent, I was comforted by the concept of a good enough parent, as developed by English pediatrician Donald Winnicott. This idea assured me that I did not need to be a perfect parent who gets it right all the time. Mercifully for me, his standard was to be doing enough parenting to make my children feel secure and loved. That logic is still appealing, but it doesn't work for everyone or every child. Nor can it be generalized to such complex institutions as the police. As the reforming Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Robert Mark, wrote about this a half-century ago, of all of the guardians of freedom, the police are now, in practice, the most important. His claim referred to the endless need for finding just the right balance between freedom of the people from interference by the state and freedom of the people from crime and violence by fellow citizens. Commissioner Mark's claim is arguably supported by the rising public expectations for police performance, which will not allow for good enough policing, despite the strong case for that idea made by the criminologist Ben Bowling about 15 years ago. And as Peter Nehru has observed, the growth of science in policing has now made it possible to move from good enough policing, or what Herbert Simon would call satisficing, to optimizing, or just right policing, not just in rare events, but in everything, or at least almost everything police do. That, in fact, is, at least arguably, how science has helped to tackle COVID, as well as fatal car crashes and fire deaths. Yet policing remains far behind other fields in its application of science. That is not for lack of science to apply. I think it's the result of scientific knowledge about policing growing at a rate that is faster than is communicated in police training or in the design of policing systems. As the most important guardians of freedom, the police have a most important duty: to apply the best science to every decision, so that police can strive to make just right decisions as a matter of routine, including those that may encounter what becomes rare events. So what is just right policing? As the theme of the 14th Cambridge International Conference on Evidence-Based Policing, just right policing is a broad concept that applies to both quantities and qualities of policing. Some dimensions of this idea were developed in my August Vollmer Award lecture for the American Society of Criminology earlier this year, as published in the journal Criminology and Public Policy. Other dimensions can be added to the concepts addressed in that lecture and video with a more systematic approach to tracking whether policing is just right. That kind of tracking, in turn, can be discussed in any community with any police agency as a kind of checklist of enduring questions in 4 simple categories: quantity of officers, quantity of force, quality of choices police make in deciding what to do, and quality of how well they do what has been decided to be done. These categories could be simplified even further with questions. First, did the police assign just the right numbers of officers to be present at the places where they were needed most, to prevent the most harm and to detect or arrest the most harmful people? 2, did police use just the right amount of force to prevent even greater harm in every situation? No more and no less than was necessary to prevent harm as great or greater than police force itself. 3, did police use just the right selection of tactics based, if possible, on prior testing to reduce maximum harm in the short run as well as over many years to come? And 4, did police deploy the best tactics in the best way, or were there errors of omission or commission in the course of deployment? The importance of asking these questions whenever a single signal incident occurs is to learn from failure, as we do with airplane crashes, as we do with fatal fires and fatal collisions of vehicles. Whenever something goes badly wrong in policing, these 4 questions can be a starting point for what the diagnosis or postmortem must be, a postmortem that might inform future premortems in planning for or developing new policies for the kinds of incidents that have a high risk of becoming signal events of criticism against police for under or over policing. Those signal events, which attract a measure of negative publicity among a substantial or above a substantial threshold, can be assembled and categorized as to which of the 4 questions were most relevant. In short, do we have In short, do we have a disaster database in policing comparable to the data that has been assembled by the Airline Safety Board in the United States, which works on crashes all over the world? Do we have even a database on stranger murders of women at night in public which could be in the thousands if we went back 20 years across all of Britain, and instead in any one police department, it would be a very small number from which not much can be learned. But if we want to see the big picture about the events that get police into massive trouble for both under and over policing, and believe me, the George Floyd situation had plenty of precedents of suffocation issues that nobody was studying, to my knowledge, at least not in the context of developing national policy in a nation of 18,000 police forces. However we put these databases together, we can compare similar incidents that go right with similar incidents that go wrong. In fact, we can look at officers who are put on the barred list that way and compare them as people who had characteristics at the time they were hired or when they went into probationary appointments, and as they approached the end of that 2-year period, what were the things that we knew about them then before a gross misconduct conviction that led to their dismissal and their being placed on the growing barred list of the College of Policing in England and Wales, and now, as of Joseph Biden's executive order, the comparable barred list in the federal law enforcement population of over 100,000 FBI, DEA, ATF, and other agents in the U.S. So all of these questions about the right practice might be separable from the questions about the right people whose misconduct may be totally extraneous to the issue of under or over policing, as in posting police photos with murder victims online or using misogynistic language. But they may also be part of the 4 core questions, as in explaining why Derek Chauvin used excessive force on George Floyd after 19 years, 18 or 19 complaints, including shooting people on multiple occasions. The question of whether there should be a higher threshold for people to pass in order to continue as police officers and not allow that kind of pattern, or indeed the Pennsylvania state trooper who has shot and killed 4 unarmed people in isolated locations on separate occasions. What we think here is that there can be a science of critical incidents bringing disrepute upon policing, which might include some of the political struggles over under-policing of national capitals, as in Ottawa and Wellington, with respect to the recent issues in New Zealand, or with respect to statues being thrown into the Bristol Harbor. And on that note, I'm going to tell you that both of our speakers in this evening's session, our keynote speakers, have been there with under-policing, and I'm sure they've been there with over-policing. And I'm sure that they don't have the support of the kind of systems that, if fully supported, science could be providing to police agencies around the democratic world. And that science, the science that can be a science of critical incidents, like the science of automobile crashes, can provide a useful platform for these systematic postmortems. Such a database can, in turn, produce hypotheses about the risk factors that can be controlled through better design of policing systems for recruitment, training, supervision, and the digital tracking of officer behavior. So there can be such a science. Whether there will be such a science depends on the kind of people who are here tonight, who are on the Zoom call for which over 600 people are registered. I welcome you all to the opening of this conference, and I would like to introduce a very appropriate speaker as the first to address these issues in this conference, the former Chief Constable of Avon and Somerset, as well as Hampshire, a career officer who studied at the University of Liverpool and who famously defended the decision of a small number of officers not to attempt to deflect the actions of a crowd that was determined to put a master of the slave trade into the waters of Bristol Harbor. This is the kind of courage about which The speechwriter for John F. Kennedy wrote the book Profiles in Courage, and the kind of defense of operational independence of policing under a rule of law that Robert Mark writes about, that Sir Robert Peel wrote about, that many people write about, but we don't hear too much of it about it from governments in recent times around the world.